Hey, and welcome back to my debate on whether horrendous suffering disproves God. If you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out Dustin and I's opening statements in this debate, as those provide a lot more context for what you're about to watch. Links to all of the videos in this debate are available in the description. All right, on to my first rebuttal. So first, I'd like to thank Dustin for his thought-provoking first rebuttal. I've actually really enjoyed thinking hard about this argument. In my first rebuttal, I'm going to take the same format that Dustin took in his. So first, I'm going to provide some general remarks. Second, we'll go through each key premise in Dustin's argument and see how he's defended them against my criticisms. And then lastly, I'll provide some brief closing remarks. Dustin begins his first rebuttal by claiming that the view that logical forms of the problem of evil are dead is philosophically outdated. So first, note that I never said that logical forms of the problem of evil are dead. If that was my view, there wouldn't be much sense in engaging Dustin's argument. Second, the reason that I pointed out that logical versions aren't taken too seriously by contemporary philosophers was not to highlight the fact that they're dead, but to highlight the relative boldness. Okay, logical versions of the problem of evil utilize premises that purport to be necessarily true, rather than contingently true. If I were to claim that cats exist, it wouldn't take much to meet that burden of proof. But what if I were to claim that cats necessarily exist? Wouldn't that claim require a higher burden of proof? It would. And that's the point. Logical versions of the problem of evil are much more difficult to defend. They require a higher burden of proof. Now, unfortunately, Dustin misinterprets a high burden of proof with a demand for certainty.
His entire opening statement was predicated on an unrealistic demand for certainty in the premises, when in reality, all I need to do is show that they're more plausible than not.
Dustin has unfortunately chosen to strawman my position. I never claimed that Dustin must prove that his premises are true with certainty. Again, the point is simply that Dustin has a very high burden of proof, a level that Dustin still hasn't come close to meeting. Next, Dustin claims that my responses were, quote, minimalist.
Instead of trying to show that the argument fails because the premises aren't likely to be true, he essentially goes completely on the defensive to try and show how they might possibly, kinda, if you think hard enough, be false. Well, where are the big guns?
So this is a pretty clear attempt at shifting the burden of proof, and unfortunately, it's not the only attempt. Dustin attempts to shift the burden throughout his first rebuttal. I'll quickly remind the audience of the dialectical context. This is Dustin's argument. It's not my argument. It is not my job to show that Dustin's premises are false. It's Dustin's job to show that his premises are true. Now, Dustin might prefer as some kind of personal preference that I provide rebutting defeaters to his argument, but undercutting defeaters will work just fine here. Moreover, while we're using weapon analogies, big guns might have been warranted had Dustin brought more than a plastic spork to the fight. Premise 1. Premise 1 is the premise about our deepest good given theism. The claim is that our deepest good is a personal relationship with God. Schellenberg's defense of this premise was originally an appeal to intuition. And in my opening statement, I pointed out that an appeal to intuition won't work on someone like me that doesn't share this intuition. I then asked Dustin to provide an argument for the truth of his first premise. Remember, high burden of proof. So how does Dustin respond? Well, instead of provide an argument, he merely asserts that his first premise is analytically true, which means true by definition.
For any personal creatures that such a being creates, it just follows from what God means that their deepest good would be to evermore experience the reality of the most amazing, supreme, dazzling being that there is.
So the problem here is that Dustin has provided absolutely no reason at all to think that once we understand what the term God means, it follows analytically that for any finite person, their deepest good is relationship with God. All he's done here is assert that his first premise falls out of the concept of God. But what he needs to do is provide an argument that this is the case. Dustin has unfortunately made zero progress in his first rebuttal on premise 1. Now, before we move on to premise 2, I want to remind the audience that despite what Dustin might say, it is not my job to provide an argument that his first premise is false. Nor is it my job to provide and defend an alternative deepest good. I don't have a burden of proof in this dialectical context. The burden of proof lies solely with Dustin. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, I'd like to quickly remind you that our ministry is currently operating at a net monthly deficit. If you'd like to support the work of capturing Christianity, of exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief, head over to our Patreon to pledge your support. The link to our Patreon is in the description of this video and in every video. Thank you in advance. All right, on to premise 2. Premise 2, if you recall, is the premise that says if God exists, horrific suffering isn't necessary for any finite person to have their deepest relationship with God. Now, this premise was originally defended by a quote from Schellenberg, in which he argues that some people can realize their deepest relationship with God without horrific suffering. In response, I explained that this defense was insufficient. Just because most people don't need to experience horrific suffering to realize their deepest relationship with God, it doesn't follow that no one does. It's a non sequitur. In a similar way, just because most people don't need to skydive in order to live their most fulfilling life, it doesn't follow that no one does. So Dustin responds not by addressing the insufficiency that I pointed out, but by having us imagine what would be true if his second premise were false. We should pause and note, I think, that this is at least progress. Dustin has moved away from the original reasoning he provided and is moving towards something new. The new reasoning is as follows. If horrific suffering is necessary for even just one person to realize their deepest good, then God needs horrific suffering. However, this is a bad inference. When it was time for my son to receive his vaccines, one might say that he had a need. He needed to get vaccinated. Now, as his father, I allowed him to get vaccinated, but I wasn't thereby the person that needed to get vaccinated. His need wasn't my need. Similarly, if someone needs to experience horrific suffering to realize their deepest good, it doesn't follow that God needs horrific suffering. All that follows is that some individual or group of individuals has a need. Our needs are not God's needs. So this argument is a non sequitur. Dustin might respond by saying that my son's need produced a need for me. I needed to get him vaccinated. But what does this actually mean? I think the best interpretation seems to be in terms of moral obligations. I had a moral obligation to allow my son to get vaccinated. The corollary would be that our needing to experience horrific suffering to realize our deepest good would produce a moral obligation on God's part. God would be morally obligated to permit horrific suffering. But even if that's true, how is that supposed to be a problem for theists? Like, what is the argument here? Now, Dustin says that God's riches are so deep, his goodness so inexhaustible, that no one would ever need to experience horrific suffering in order to experience their deepest relationship with God. But this is quite clearly begging the question. Dustin is assuming the very thing under contention. And moreover, in my opening statement, I mentioned the work of Marilyn McCord Adams. In her work, she argues that on the Christian story, those that experience horrific suffering can identify with God in a way that those that don't experience horrific suffering can't. Dustin did not respond to this. Instead, he merely asserts that his premise is analytically true. So to take it a step further, I actually want you to pause this video, go to Google, and search Holocaust survivor closer to God. And what you might find might actually shock you. There are dozens of documented cases of Holocaust survivors for which their horrors arguably brought them closer to God. For a specific example, look up Viktor Frankl. Some other good books are The Triumph of Wounded Souls and The Faith and Doubt of Holocaust Survivors. So it is literally empirically false that horrors can't contribute to a deeper, more meaningful view of God and the world. In his second rebuttal, I challenged Dustin to provide powerful arguments for the truth of his first and second premises. And yes, they must be powerful to meet his high burden of proof. And remember, if any of the premises we're discussing are just possibly false, then his argument fails. And until he does that, we do not have adequate reason to think that either premise is true. All right, moving on to premise 4. This is the premise that says if no one needs to experience horrific suffering to realize their deepest good, then God would not allow horrific suffering. Now, this is the premise that makes claims about what God would or wouldn't do. Premise 4 was originally defended by appealing to divine empathy. God is maximally empathetic and hence wouldn't let someone experience horrific suffering unless it contributed to their deepest good. In response, I pointed out that empathy doesn't by itself tell us how God ought to respond to his empathetic knowledge. Empathy is just knowing what it's like to be someone else. I can know exactly what it's like to be Hitler, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to respond to that knowledge with mercy and compassion. Next, I argued that God is going to respond compassionately to his empathetic knowledge, but his compassion will be consistent with reason. And reason might dictate that there are great goods, like soul building, that are distinct from our deepest goods, but that nevertheless morally justify horrific suffering. And God, being perfectly rational, will not ignore these great goods. In reply, Dustin asserts that the greatest goods are already present in God.
The greatest goods must be contained in and modeled by God. And this is so, all without the presence or possibility of evil.
So there are several problems with this. First, notice the pattern. I asked Dustin for an argument, and he responds not by actually giving an argument, but by making assertions. Second, it's highly debatable, to put it lightly, that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God. Think back to the goods that I mentioned earlier, the exemplification of virtues like forgiveness, of courage, and sacrifice. Notice these goods are about the exemplification of virtues, not the disposition of virtues. With that in mind, how can God, all by himself, exemplify sacrifice? How can God perform acts of forgiveness prior to creating anything? How does that work? It doesn't. Third, in my view, exemplifying virtue is greater than merely being disposed toward virtue. So I actually think that it's false that the greatest goods must be contained in or modeled by God. Now, this is actually a really important point, so I hope that Dustin doesn't miss this one. Fourth, even if we suppose that God can somehow model these goods without allowing suffering, which I think is actually impossible, there's a difference between the value of a being and the value of a world. Nothing Dustin says here rules out the possibility that a world containing a profuse array and diversity of these goods, together with their accompanying evils, would be better than a world containing only God, God's single model of the relevant goods and no suffering. And yet he would need to rule this out for his reply here to succeed. So Dustin is actually really running out of time here. He needs to start making some arguments in defense of his premises. In closing, Dustin has made a series of assertions, no arguments, and has repeatedly attempted to shift the burden of proof. What Dustin needs to do in his second rebuttal is provide powerful arguments that his premises are not just true, but necessarily true. And again, if any one of his crucial premises is just possibly false, the argument fails. I can only hope that Dustin's second rebuttal will be higher caliber than his first.